I still remember the sound before I remember the words. The sharp crack of a hammer driving a nail straight into the old oak siding of my barn. By the time I stepped outside with my morning coffee, someone was already pulling away in a white SUV, leaving behind a bright violation notice flapping in the breeze like a flag planted by an invading army. The headline was impossible to miss. Violation of community aesthetic standards. Underneath it sat a fine for $4,000 and a warning that failure to comply within 14 days could result in legal action. I just stood there for a minute, coffee getting cold in my hand, staring at a building that had been standing longer than most of the people living across the road had been alive. They called it ugly. That barn wasn't ugly to me. Every scar on those weathered boards had a story. Every beam had fingerprints from my father, my grandfather, and eventually my own. We rebuilt half of it after a tornado rolled through western Kentucky back in the late 80s. I could still picture Dad balancing on the rafters with a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, laughing every time I missed a nail with my hammer. He used to tell me, "A barn doesn't have to impress anybody, son. It just has to stand when the wind comes." Funny how those words came back to me years later while I was staring at a piece of paper written by people who thought appearances mattered more than history. My name's Caleb Mercer, and my family has owned those 3 acres since my great-grandfather bought them after returning from the First World War. We never lived inside Cedar Ridge Estates. We weren't members of their homeowners association. Our property sat just outside their fancy stone entrance, separated by an old fence line that had been there longer than the subdivision itself. When the developers first showed up nearly 8 years earlier, they promised we'd barely notice them. Quiet neighborhood, they said. Good neighbors. They even brought over homemade cookies the first week construction started. Looking back, I guess that was cheaper than honesty. Little by little, the farmland disappeared. Cornfields turned into cul-de-sacs. Old oak trees became driveways. The sounds of tractors were replaced with landscaping crews blowing leaves off sidewalks that didn't have a single leaf on them. Then came the clubhouse. Big windows, polished timber, expensive outdoor furniture, and a second-story balcony with a perfect view across the fields. Unfortunately for them, that perfect view also included my old red barn. At first, it was just little comments. I'd hear them when I drove past. Someone should really paint that thing. It brings property values down. One afternoon, I was fixing the fence when a couple walking their golden retriever actually stopped at the property line. The woman smiled politely and asked, "Have you ever thought about replacing it with something newer?" I smiled back and said, "Have you ever thought about replacing your husband with someone newer?" Her husband laughed so hard, she dragged him away before he could apologize. I figured that would be the end of it. Turns out people who can't win an argument sometimes go looking for authority instead. 3 days after the first notice appeared, another one showed up. This time it threatened liens. 2 days later came another, warning of mandatory compliance hearings. They weren't even pretending to ask anymore. They acted like they already owned the place. What bothered me wasn't the money. $4,000 would have hurt, sure, but it wasn't the point. What bothered me was the assumption that if they repeated something often enough, eventually I'd start believing they had the right to say it. That evening, my neighbor Earl stopped by in his old pickup. Earl had farmed the next property over for nearly 40 years before leasing most of his land. He looked at the notice, scratched his gray beard, and let out a low whistle. "They're getting bold. Think I should just ignore it?" I asked. Earl shook his head. "No. People like that mistake silence for surrender." The next morning, I finally called the number printed at the bottom of the notice. A woman transferred me to the HOA president, a man named Grant Holloway. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that sounded like it belonged in real estate commercials. "Mr. Mercer," he said pleasantly, "we're simply trying to preserve community standards." "Community?" I answered. "I don't live in your community." There was a short pause before he replied. "Your property affects the visual experience of our residents." I actually laughed. So now I'm responsible for what people see when they look off their own balcony. We're prepared to pursue every legal option available against someone who never signed your bylaws. Another pause, longer this time. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes cooperation is easier than conflict." I thanked him for his time and hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night, I carried an old folding chair out to the barn and watched the lights come on across Cedar Ridge. Every house looked almost identical. Same roofs, same paint colors, Same tiny decorative trees planted exactly the same distance from every driveway. Everything looked perfect, almost too perfect. Sitting there in the quiet, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's attic. Years ago, when I was helping him clean it out after Grandma passed away, we'd uncovered an old cedar trunk packed with faded maps, yellowed deeds, handwritten letters, and county records dating back generations. Grandpa held up one brittle document and smiled. "Never underestimate old paper," he'd told me. "Most people think history belongs in museums, but sometimes it shows up in courtrooms." I hadn't thought about those words in years. But sitting there under that old barn roof, with the HOA threatening property they had no business touching, something about that memory refused to leave me alone. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was stubbornness. Either way, before the sun came up the next morning, I'd already made up my mind. Instead of arguing with people who thought they made the rules, I was going to find out who actually did. And that decision, more than anything else, would end up changing not just my life, but the future of the entire neighborhood across the road. The county records office sat inside an old brick courthouse that somehow managed to smell exactly the same every time I walked through those heavy wooden doors: dust, paper, and coffee that had probably been sitting on a warmer since sunrise. The young woman behind the front desk asked if she could help me, and when I explained I was looking for historical land governance records dating back close to a century, she gave me the same puzzled look people usually reserve for someone asking where they keep dinosaur bones. A few minutes later, an older clerk named Martha overheard our conversation and smiled. "Follow me," she said. "Nobody asks for the old books anymore." She led me down a narrow staircase into a basement lined with steel shelves packed with thick leather-bound ledgers, rolled survey maps, and filing cabinets that looked older than I was. "Most folks think everything's online," she said while pulling a heavy volume onto a wooden table. "They're usually wrong." I spent hours turning brittle pages, reading legal language written by people who probably traveled here on horseback. Most of it had nothing to do with my situation, but every once in a while I'd find a note in the margin, a court reference, or an amendment that pointed somewhere else. Around mid-afternoon, Martha walked back, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Still hunting?" she asked. "Either I'm chasing a ghost," I answered, "or I'm getting close." She laughed. "That's usually how history works." About 30 minutes later, I found it. Buried inside an agricultural governance revision from the early 1920s was a section dealing with private associations attempting to regulate neighboring agricultural land outside their membership boundaries. The language was old-fashioned, but the meaning couldn't have been clearer. If a private organization exercised authority over non-member property owners without lawful jurisdiction, that action could trigger judicial review of the organization's governing authority and administrative compliance. I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Then a 4th. My hands were actually shaking a little. The law wasn't some forgotten myth my grandfather had dreamed up. It was real. And if the HOA had crossed that line, they had opened a door they probably didn't even know existed. Before I left the courthouse, I asked Martha to make certified copies of every relevant page. She looked over the documents, then looked back at me. "Somebody bothering you?" she asked. I smiled. They picked the wrong barn. On the drive home, I called a local attorney named Daniel Reeves. Dan had handled a boundary dispute for Earl years earlier, and around here his reputation was simple. He didn't waste words, and he didn't chase publicity. We met the following morning in his office above an old hardware store downtown. He listened without interrupting while I laid the notices across his desk one by one. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and quietly asked, "You're not part of Cedar Ridge?" "Never have been." "Never signed any covenants?" "Nope." "Never agreed to architectural control?" "Not once." He rubbed his chin before reaching for the copies I'd made at the courthouse. After nearly 20 minutes of reading, he slowly lowered the papers and looked straight at me. "Caleb," he said, "I've practiced property law for 26 years. I've read references to this statute before, but I've never had a client with facts that actually fit it. Is that good?" I asked. "It's interesting," he replied with a grin. Interesting usually makes judges pay attention. Over the next week, we built our case piece by piece. We photographed every notice the HOA had nailed to my barn. We gathered county property maps proving my land had never been annexed into Cedar Ridge. We collected tax records, deed histories, survey reports, and statements from longtime neighbors confirming the property had remained independent for generations. Earl even found an old newspaper clipping announcing the subdivision's construction years earlier, where the developers publicly promised neighboring landowners would remain completely unaffected by HOA governance. "That'll look nice in court," Dan said with a smile. Then came the petition. We weren't suing because they thought my barn was ugly. We weren't asking for money. We were asking the county to determine whether the HOA board had exercised legal authority it simply didn't possess, and if so, whether its broader governance practices deserved formal review. When we filed the paperwork, the deputy clerk looked over the first page, then glanced back at me. "You understand this could become a very big deal?" she asked. "I didn't make it a big deal," I answered. "They did when they nailed that first notice to my wall." Word traveled faster than I expected. Small towns have their own internet, and it's called people talking. Within 3 days, everyone seemed to know some version of the story. At the diner, folks asked Earl if I was really trying to shut down the HOA. At the feed store, strangers wanted to know if my barn had become famous. Even my niece called from Louisville asking, "Uncle Caleb, are you going viral or something?" I laughed and told her I was just trying to mind my own business. Unfortunately, my business had become everyone else's entertainment. Cedar Ridge reacted exactly the opposite way. They called emergency board meetings. Residents received emails labeled "Confidential Legal Update." Lawyers started showing up at the clubhouse almost daily. One afternoon I drove past and counted 7 luxury SUVs parked outside. Apparently, preserving neighborhood beauty had become surprisingly expensive. About 2 weeks after filing, I received a certified letter requesting an informal meeting with the HOA board before county mediation began. Dan advised me to attend, but to say very little. "Let them talk," he said. "People reveal more when they're trying to convince themselves than when they're trying to convince you." The meeting took place inside their clubhouse overlooking the very barn they wanted gone. I couldn't help noticing how carefully they'd arranged everything. Bottled water, fresh flowers, leather chairs. It looked less like a legal discussion and more like a magazine advertisement for suburban perfection. Grant Holloway greeted me with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. You nailed enough invitations to my property," I replied. Figured I'd eventually accept one. A couple of board members shifted uncomfortably. Grant cleared his throat. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." "You started by trespassing," I answered calmly. "That usually does it." Their attorney tried steering the conversation toward compromise. "Our clients simply wish to resolve an unfortunate misunderstanding." Dan finally spoke for the first time. "Wonderful," he said. "Which part was misunderstood? The repeated fines against a non-member, or the threats of enforcement beyond your jurisdiction?" The room went quiet. Grant folded his hands together. Our architectural committee believed visual impact extended beyond property lines. Dan nodded politely. Belief and authority are two very different things. Nobody had an answer for that. The meeting ended after less than 40 minutes with no agreement. As we walked toward the parking lot, Grant caught up with me beside my truck. "You know," he said quietly, "this doesn't have to become public." I looked at him for a second before answering. "It became public the moment your people nailed legal threats to a building my father rebuilt with his own hands." He sighed. "You're making this personal." "No," I said, opening the driver's door. "You made it personal. I'm just making it legal." By the end of the month, the county formally opened a compliance review into Cedar Ridge's governing procedures. That's when the real trouble started. Not because of anything I discovered, but because investigators began asking questions the board had apparently hoped nobody would ever ask. Election records didn't match meeting minutes. Amendments had been approved without proper quorum. Fine schedules had been changed without required notice. Reserve funds lacked supporting documentation. Even residents who had defended the board for years suddenly started demanding explanations. One evening, Earl called me laughing so hard he could barely finish the sentence. "They spent years telling everybody to read the bylaws," he said. "Now the homeowners are actually reading them." Every new meeting seemed to end with more arguments than answers. Longtime residents accused board members of hiding information. New homeowners questioned whether previous fines had even been enforceable. Social media pages filled with debates that went on until 2 in the morning. It wasn't my lawsuit tearing the neighborhood apart. It was years of people finally asking questions nobody had been allowed to ask before. And as the county's investigation continued gathering momentum, I began to realize something surprising. This had stopped being about my old barn a long time ago. It had become a reckoning for an entire system that had quietly convinced itself nobody would ever challenge its authority. By the time the county scheduled its final hearing, nearly 2 months had passed since that first notice showed up on my barn door, and somewhere along the way I realized I had stopped worrying about the outcome. Maybe it was because I'd already learned something more valuable than winning. Maybe it was because I had finally remembered what my father always believed, that standing your ground isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about refusing to move when you know you're standing on the truth. The hearing itself wasn't dramatic the way television likes to pretend courtrooms are. There were no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors, no emotional speeches that changed everyone's minds. Just stacks of documents, patient questions, careful answers, and facts that slowly painted a picture nobody on the HOA board wanted anyone to see. The county attorney walked through every notice they had issued against my property, every threat of enforcement, every procedural mistake uncovered during the compliance review. Then came the governance records. Missing signatures, improper voting procedures, amendments that had never been legally adopted, financial policies implemented without the approvals their own bylaws required. None of those problems existed because of me. They had been there all along. My little red barn had simply become the loose thread that unraveled the entire sweater. Grant Holloway sat across the room, looking nothing like the confident man I'd spoken to on the phone weeks earlier. He looked tired, older somehow. Every once in a while he'd whisper something to his attorney before quietly shaking his head. When the county administrator finally announced the decision, nobody looked surprised anymore. The current board would be dissolved pending a complete restructuring of the association. New elections would be supervised. Governance procedures would undergo mandatory compliance review before enforcement authority could resume. Existing penalties issued under questionable authority would be reevaluated. It wasn't a victory parade. It was accountability. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for comments, but I slipped out a side entrance with Dan before anyone noticed. "You just made local history," he said while unlocking his truck. I smiled. "I'd rather go feed my chickens." 3 days later, just before sunset, I heard tires crunching across my gravel driveway. I looked up from repairing an old gate hinge and saw Grant climbing out of his SUV alone. No attorney, no board members, no clipboard, just him. He walked over slowly and stopped a few feet away from the barn. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then he looked up at the weathered wood and quietly admitted, "It's actually not as ugly as I remembered." I couldn't help laughing. Funny how perspective changes. He nodded. "I owe you an apology." That wasn't something I'd expected to hear. He explained that the board had become so focused on protecting property values that they'd stopped asking whether they actually had the authority to do the things they were doing. Every complaint became another rule. Every rule became another enforcement letter. Nobody questioned it because nobody wanted to be the person slowing things down. "We convinced ourselves we were helping," he said. "Somewhere along the way we forgot there were limits." Then he handed me a folder. Inside was a formal letter withdrawing every violation issued against my property, another document recognizing my barn as a protected agricultural structure outside HOA jurisdiction, and a proposal offering to contribute toward preservation work if I ever decided to restore the building. I closed the folder and handed it back. "I appreciate the gesture," I said honestly, "but this barn doesn't need your money." He looked confused. I rested my hand against one of the old support posts my father and I had installed decades earlier. Every mark on these boards was earned. Every repair tells part of my family's story. If I covered all of that with fresh paint just because somebody finally approved of it, it wouldn't really be the same barn anymore. Grant looked at the building one last time before extending his hand. This time I shook it, not because everything had been forgotten, but because some lessons are worth more when they're learned than when they're punished. After he drove away, Earl pulled into the driveway like he'd somehow known the meeting had happened. "Well," he asked through the open truck window, "they surrendered?" I smiled. "No, they finally listened." Earl chuckled. "That's even rarer." Life settled down after that. Cedar Ridge elected a completely new board. Homeowners started attending meetings instead of ignoring them. Financial reports became public. Enforcement procedures became transparent. People asked questions without being treated like troublemakers. As for me, I kept living exactly the way I always had. The barn still leans a little toward the west after heavy rain. The paint is still faded. The roof still creaks when winter winds roll across the fields. And every now and then I'll catch someone slowing down on the county road to look at it. Maybe they're admiring an old building. Maybe they've heard the story. Either way, it makes me smile. Because that old barn taught me something I wish more people understood. Age doesn't make something worthless. Imperfection doesn't erase its value. And authority without humility eventually creates its own downfall. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't tear something down or build something bigger. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone else rewrite the meaning of what already belongs to you. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought power automatically made them right, I'd really like to hear your story. Do you think I went too far? Or do you believe the board crossed a line the moment they tried to control property that wasn't theirs? Share your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations are always more interesting when everyone brings their own experience to the table. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a good story about standing your ground, respecting history, and remembering that sometimes the oldest laws are still the strongest ones.